Welcome to the Pro Ticker Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
The global economy is facing a watershed moment right now.
It absolutely is.
It's mid-March 2026, and we are staring down what the trading desks from Wall Street to Tokyo are already calling Black March.
Right.
We're looking at a massive, unprecedented geopolitical conflict involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran that has, well, it's effectively paralyzed the Strait of Hormuz.
Completely shut it down.
Exactly. The absolute most critical choke point for global energy is closed to commercial shipping.
Which is staggering to even think about.
So the mission of this deep dive is to really dissect the anatomy of this massive oil shock.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen Brent crude just absolutely rip past $119 a barrel.
A historic spike.
Yeah. We're going to explore the G7's historic 400 million barrel gamble to try and put a floor under the global macroeconomy. We'll identify the clear winners and the devastating losers in the stock market carnage we've witnessed over the last 2 weeks.
There are definitely both.
And crucially, we are going to explain exactly what this shifting geopolitical tectonics means for you, the listener, what it means for your portfolio and your daily life. Okay, let's unpack this.
It is absolutely essential to frame this correctly right out of the gate.
Right.
We are not just looking at a regional geopolitical flare-up. What we are witnessing is a structural, physical disruption to the foundational plumbing of the global financial order.
The plumbing itself is broken.
Exactly. The mechanics of how energy moves, how it's priced, and how it acts as the primary input cost for the entire global economy, they have been fundamentally broken in the span of just a few weeks.
It's been incredibly fast.
The shockwaves are already forcing central banks into impossible corners and violently repricing asset classes across the board.
I want to start right at the geographical epicenter because I think it's easy to lose sight of the physical reality when we're just looking at tickers flashing red on a screen.
Yeah, you have to look at the map.
The Strait of Hormuz. It's a 21-mile wide waterway. Just 21 miles.
It's tiny.
You could run a marathon across it and have miles to spare, yet traditionally 20% of the world's daily oil supply.
And 20% of its liquefied natural gas.
Exactly. All of it passes through that tiny bottleneck. And right now, as we sit here today, it is effectively closed.
Shut tight.
The market impact was instantaneous. We saw Brent crude surge past $119 a barrel. That's a massive 78% increase since the conflict escalated in late February.
Just a vertical line on the chart.
It has since settled into this incredibly nervous, highly volatile trading range between $86 and $109. But the damage to the market psyche is already done.
It really is.
But here's where I want to push back a bit. We've had Middle East tensions before. We had the 2022 shock. The market always adapts.
True, usually.
So why are bond traders and equity managers treating this specific Hormuz blockade like an extinction-level event for the current economic cycle?
What's fascinating here is the specific mechanical nature of this disruption. Economists and energy analysts are defining this as a simultaneous supply and buffer shock.
A buffer shock.
Right. To understand why this is terrifying the institutional money, we have to look at how the global oil market usually absorbs damage.
Okay.
Historically, when there is a supply disruption, say a major pipeline gets knocked offline in North America, or a regional conflict halts production in a specific North African nation, the market looks to OPEC plus hate.
Right, specifically to the spare capacity held by nations like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Precisely. They act as the central bankers of oil.
The shock absorbers.
Exactly. They deliberately maintain millions of barrels of unused production capacity for moments exactly like this. When a shock hits, they open the taps, the extra oil flows into the market, the deficit is covered, and the price stabilizes.
The buffer absorbs the shock.
But right now, the buffer is essentially trapped in the garage.
Because the bottleneck we are facing today is purely logistical.
Exactly. It is a physical blockade of the shipping lanes. The spare capacity of Saudi Arabia and the UAE still exists under the sand. They can easily pump it out of the ground.
But they can't move it.
They cannot put it on a very large crude carrier, a VLCC, and sail it to the refineries in Rotterdam or Shanghai. The shock absorber hasn't been destroyed.
It has been completely neutralized by geography.
Yes.
Which leads us into the terrifying quantitative math of this crisis.
Yeah.
The market is trying to price in a daily missing gap of roughly 6.2 to 6.9 million barrels per day.
A massive hole.
But instead of just looking at the aggregate number, walk me through the specific country-by-country breakdown, because the nuances of how these barrels are trapped matter immensely.
They absolutely do.
Let's start with the heavyweight, Saudi Arabia.
The Saudis are in an incredibly difficult position. They've been forced to cut roughly 2.0 to 2.5 million barrels per day.
Wow.
And this isn't just about the shipping lanes being physically blocked. It's the direct kinetic threat of missiles
Hmm.
to their offshore loading facilities and the tankers themselves.
Right, the insurance aspect.
Exactly. No maritime insurance company on Earth is going to underwrite a vessel sailing into that environment right now. So the Saudis are executing their contingency plan,
Which is to divert oil overland.
right, through their massive east-west pipeline. The goal is to pump the crude entirely across the Arabian Peninsula to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea, completely bypassing the Hormuz choke point.
But there's a catch, right? I keep hearing about infrastructure limits. Why can't they just divert all their trapped exports through that Red Sea pipeline?
Physics and engineering.
Okay.
The east-west pipeline is an absolute marvel of infrastructure, but it is currently hard-capped at a maximum throughput of 4 million barrels per day.
So there's a hard ceiling.
You are dealing with pipeline diameter, the sheer horsepower of the pumping stations, pushing millions of gallons of heavy liquid across a desert,
Oh.
and the loading capacity at Yanbu. They literally cannot squeeze another drop through it.
So even running at 100% maximum capacity, it leaves that 2 to 2.5 million barrel deficit stranded.
Exactly.
Then you look at Iraq, and their situation seems even more paralyzed. They've had to cut 3.1 to 3.2 million barrels per day.
Iraq is effectively landlocked from an export perspective right now. Their alternative northern pipeline, which traditionally runs to the Mediterranean port of Ceyhan, has been closed due to separate, ongoing geopolitical and legal disputes.
Ah, right.
So with their northern route dead and the southern route through Hormuz blocked, their exports are stranded at the docks in Basra.
Just sitting there.
Their last tanker managed to load back on March 8th. Since then, it has been absolute zero. The oil is just backing up into the domestic system.
Which brings us to the storage problem. The United Arab Emirates has cut 0.5 to 0.8 million barrels per day. But their issue isn't just the shipping lane, it's that they literally have nowhere left to put the oil.
The UAE made a calculated gamble in the early days of this crisis. They kept pumping, hoping for a rapid diplomatic resolution.
But it didn't happen.
It didn't. They filled every available domestic storage tank. Now their storage is completely full to the brim.
What about their bypass?
They do have a bypass pipeline, the AD-COP line, which runs to the Gulf of Oman, bypassing Hormuz, but they are running it dangerously over its intended capacity,
Straining the infrastructure.
straining it to its absolute limits. And once storage is full and the bypass is maxed out, you have no choice but to physically shut in the wells.
And we're seeing the legal ramifications of those shut-ins. Kuwait has had to cut 0.6 to 1.1 million barrels per day.
And they went ahead and officially declared force majeure on their exports back in early March.
That was a massive psychological blow to the market.
Huge. When a major sovereign producer formally issues a force majeure declaration, it sends a chill through every trading desk globally.
Because it's a legal shield.
Yes, it's the official legal notification to all their international buyers' refineries in Asia, chemical plants in Europe, saying, look, the contract is suspended.
We can't deliver.
We cannot deliver the crude you bought, and we are legally protected from the financial fallout of breaching that contract.
Which sparks panic.
It immediately triggers a scramble in the spot market, as those buyers desperately try to find replacement barrels to keep their facilities running.
And then there is Bahrain. Their cut is smaller in absolute terms, about 0.4 million barrels per day. But the nature of their disruption is uniquely severe.
Because Bahrain didn't just lose a shipping lane, they lost critical physical infrastructure.
The kinetic strike.
Yes, they suffered a direct kinetic military strike that disabled their Citral refinery. This moves the crisis from a purely logistical choke point to physical destruction of processing capacity.
You can't just bypass that.
No, it takes massive capital and significant time to rebuild a complex refinery. Those refined product barrels are gone from the market for the foreseeable future.
So when you aggregate all of this, the Saudis maxing out their bypass, the Iraqis landlocked, the UAE overflowing, Kuwait tearing up contracts, and Bahrain taking a direct hit.
It's a perfect storm.
Groups like Rystad Energy have run the extrapolation models. Their estimate is that even assuming maximum diversion, meaning every alternative pipeline on the peninsula running at 110%, the world faces an acute absolute shortfall of at least 8 million barrels per day.
8 million barrels.
I want to pause here because it's easy for our listeners to hear 8 million barrels and just think of it as a statistical abstraction. But what does a daily 8 million barrel liquidity drain actually do to the physical global economy?
Think about it as starving the global supply chain of its primary calorie source.
Okay.
Imagine 8 million barrels vanishing overnight every single day. That is the heavy bunker fuel required for the massive cargo ships bringing semiconductors from Taiwan to California.
Right.
It is the highly refined jet fuel necessary for global logistics networks like FedEx and UPS to function. It is the diesel fuel powering the trucks delivering food to your local grocery store. And the massive agricultural combines harvesting crops in the Midwest.
It touches everything.
Everything. When you remove 8 million barrels a day from that incredibly tightly wound, just-in-time logistics system, you don't just get higher prices, you get structural friction.
Delivery time stretch.
Freight costs quadruple. Profit margins for manufacturers evaporate. It is a catastrophic reduction in the literal liquidity that makes global trade possible.
And that catastrophic reduction is exactly what triggered the absolute panic in the halls of global power. The realization that the free market, left to its own devices, could not fix a physical blockade.
The invisible hand cannot move an aircraft carrier.
No, it can't. Which brings us to the diplomatic architecture of the crisis response. What we are essentially looking at as Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the G7's emergency playbook.
Phase 1 was heavily focused on the financial markets, kicking off on March 9th with an emergency virtual summit.
Who was there?
We had the finance ministers from the G7 nations, the US, Japan, Germany, France, the UK, Italy, and Canada, convening on a secure line. Crucially, they brought in Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency.
But the goal of that March 9th meeting wasn't to physically pump oil that very second. It was entirely about market psychology, wasn't it?
It was about sending a massive, coordinated signal to the algorithmic trading programs and the hedge funds.
To calm them down.
The primary goal was to construct a psychological ceiling. In a massive disruption like this, the physical shortage is only half the problem. The other half is the speculative panic.
Because traders look at the missing 8 million barrels
and start bidding the futures price of oil up to $150, $180, even $200 a barrel, purely out of fear of what might happen next week.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. The G7 finance ministers needed to step to the microphone collectively and essentially say, we possess a massive strategic bazooka, and we are absolutely prepared to fire it.
They issued a joint statement
declaring their readiness to take any and all necessary measures to support global energy supply.
Yeah.
They were trying to talk the market down off the ledge.
Which bought them exactly 24 hours. Because Phase 2 happened the very next day, March 10th.
Right.
The conversation shifted from the finance ministers handling the money and the market psychology to the energy ministers handling the actual physical plumbing of the global energy grid.
This was the Paris meeting.
Yes, hosted by the IEA.
Yeah.
You had figures like the Japanese industry minister, Ryosei Akazawa, heavily involved, shifting the dialogue from if we intervene to exactly how we execute it. And here's where it gets really interesting.
The scale. The sheer unprecedented scale of the intervention they are modeling.
The numbers that have leaked out of those closed-door sessions in Paris are staggering.
They are.
We are talking about a proposed coordinated release from the global strategic petroleum reserves of 300 to 400 million barrels. Let me contextualize that massive number for you.
It's massive.
The total public emergency reserves held by the IEA member nations across the entire globe is roughly 1.2 billion barrels. The G7 is seriously discussing dumping 25 to 35% of the entire world's emergency safety net onto the open market in one massive coordinated flood.
It is a breathtaking gamble, and it represents a profound, albeit forced, shifting of the global power dynamic.
How so?
For over half a century, OPEC has been the undisputed market maker. They held the spare capacity. They dictated the marginal price of a barrel of oil.
But right now,
because of the physical blockade in the Strait, OPEC Plus has been completely neutralized. They are relegated to watching from the sidelines.
so the G7 has to step in.
Consequently, the G7, a coalition of the world's wealthiest consumer nations, has effectively been forced to step into the void as the new global swing producer of last resort.
That is a wild inversion of the natural order. The consumers are weaponizing their emergency storage to act like a producer cartel just to break the pricing power of the crisis.
Exactly. They're utilizing their strategic reserves not just as a domestic backup to keep the lights on, but as an aggressive, offensive financial weapon to dictate global commodity prices and prevent a cascading collapse of the global macroeconomy.
Trying to physically overwhelm the panic with raw volume.
Yes.
But as anyone who has ever dealt with massive infrastructure knows, announcing a 400 million barrel release at a press conference in Paris is one thing. Actually pulling that oil out of the ground and getting it into a gas tank is a completely different, incredibly complex beast.
A logistical nightmare.
Let's dig into the technical realities of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or the SPR, because I think there is a huge misconception out there. People picture the SPR as this giant, pristine swimming pool of refined gasoline sitting under Washington, D.C., just waiting for the president to turn a spigot.
That is the furthest thing from the truth. Let's look specifically at the physical limitations of the United States STR, which is by far the largest single component of this global safety net and the linchpin of the G7 strategy.
It's not just one big tank.
The U.S. SPR isn't one facility. It's a network of 4 heavily guarded, geographically distinct sites spread along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. Currently, it holds a total of about 416 million barrels.
And these are literally massive caverns hollowed out of underground salt domes, right?
Correct. You have Bryan Mound in Texas, holding about 185 million barrels.
Big Hill, also in Texas, with 90 million.
West Hackberry in Louisiana with 88 million, and Bayou Choctaw in Louisiana with 53 million. They pump fresh water into the salt domes to dissolve the salt, pump the brine out, and then pump the crude oil into the resulting massive underground void. It's brilliant engineering.
But the bottleneck we face right now isn't the total volume of oil sitting in those salt caverns. The bottleneck is the drawdown rate. It's how fast the physics of the plumbing allow you to bring that oil to the surface and move it.
Exactly.
The Department of Energy claims a maximum theoretical drawdown rate of 4.4 million barrels per day. Now, on paper, that sounds fantastic. If the U.S. can pump 4.4 million and the world is short 8 million, the U.S. alone just solved more than half the problem.
On paper, yes.
But if we look at the historical data specifically, the massive 180 million barrel release the administration executed back in 2022 to fight inflation, the actual sustainable limit is significantly lower. The real-world data shows they top out at about 1.1 million barrels per day over any sustained period.
And that delta between the theoretical 4.4 million and the actual 1.1 million is where the crisis lives. You cannot defy the physics of the infrastructure.
Right.
You are dealing with severe limits on the physical pipelines that pump the oil from the salt caverns to the marine terminals. You have logistical limits on the loading docks for the tankers.
The ports can only handle so much.
And, crucially, you have limits on the regional Gulf Coast refineries' ability to accept sudden, massive floods of new crude on top of their normal baseload. The plumbing simply isn't wide enough to drain the bathtub that fast.
And even if you could perfectly maximize the plumbing, there is an even bigger, much more complex technical hurdle here, something that commodity analysts call the crude mismatch problem.
Yes.
I love this part of the analysis because it explains so much of the frustration you feel at the gas pump. Walk me through the chemistry of this mismatch. Why doesn't an SPR release instantly equal cheap gas?
Because oil is not a monolithic substance. Crude oil is a catch-all term for dozens of different highly specific grades of hydrocarbons. Generally, the market categorizes them by 2 main factors.
Density and sulfur.
Right, density, which is graded from light to heavy, and sulfur content, which is graded from sweet to sour. Now look at the global market right now. Because of the specific nature of the missing Middle Eastern barrels, the market is absolutely starving for light sweet crude.
Which is the premium stuff.
Exactly. Light sweet crude is the easiest, most efficient, and cheapest grade to refine into high-value products like gasoline and diesel. But if you crack open the inventory books of the U.S. SPR, the portfolio is deeply skewed.
How skewed?
Out of that 416 million barrels, it holds about 155 million barrels of light sweet crude, but a massive 261 million barrels of medium sour crude.
And this is where the raw chicken and microwave analogy perfectly fits. The G7 is essentially saying, don't worry, we have plenty of food, and they are serving up millions of barrels of raw chicken, the medium sour crude. And the refineries are looking at it saying, great, but we only have a microwave. It doesn't solve the immediate problem.
It really doesn't.
You can't just take a complex refinery that is specifically tuned and calibrated to process light sweet crude, dump 1 million barrels of highly sulfuric medium sour crude into it, and expect it to function.
It would ruin the facility. It requires entirely different processing units, specifically massive desulfurization capacity, to handle the sour crude.
So play this out for us.
If the G7 aggressively dumps a massive volume of medium sour SPR oil onto a market that lacks the immediate idle refinery capacity to process that specific heavier, dirtier grade, you get a massive disconnect.
It lowers the headline price.
It might lower the top-line headline price of crude oil futures that you see on the financial news ticker because raw supply is increased. But it might not actually lower the price of refined, finished gasoline and diesel for you, the listener, when you pull up to your local gas station.
The raw material is slightly cheaper, but the bottleneck hasn't been solved.
It has merely moved from the blockaded ocean to the refinery door.
And on top of the chemistry mismatch, you have the unavoidable reality of time. When the president signs the executive order to release oil from the SPR, it doesn't magically materialize at the pump the next morning.
Not at all.
There is a massive operational lag. It takes anywhere from 13 to 20 days for that oil to be physically pumped out of the salt caverns, sold through an emergency auction process, loaded onto pipelines or marine vessels, delivered to a refinery, chemically processed, and then shipped out through the distribution network.
Which is why, right now, in mid-March, this massive G7 announcement is relying almost entirely on the announcement effect. It is purely verbal intervention.
A bluff.
They are playing a high-stakes game of poker with the commodities markets, trying to scare the day traders and the hedge funds into dumping their long oil positions today, based entirely on the promise that physical barrels will arrive 3 weeks from now.
But this gamble raises a profound, almost existential strategic dilemma for the United States. Because of that massive 180 million barrel release back in 2022 to combat post-pandemic inflation, the U.S. SPR is already sitting at historic 40-year lows.
Right.
We only have about 416 million barrels left in the bank. If the G7 coordinates this 400 million barrel global release and the U.S. contributes its typical outsized share to lead the coalition, we are effectively draining the bathtub.
It is a terrifying prospect from a national security standpoint. If they drain the SPR down to bare minimum operating levels now, just to cool prices in March and save the Q2 economic data, what happens if this geopolitical conflict doesn't resolve?
Right. What if it drags on?
What happens if it escalates, spreads, and the Hormuz blockade continues into late 2026 or bleeds into 2027? There is virtually no safety net left. The U.S. will have fired its last major piece of economic ammunition, leaving the global economy completely exposed to the physical realities of the shortage.
And the immediate economic shockwaves of that exposure are already violently tearing through the markets. We need to pivot and talk about what this means for the broader macroeconomy, because the bond market is already screaming that we are looking at the very real, very ugly return of stagflation.
The bond market always knows first.
The bond traders aren't waiting for the SPR oil to hit the market. They are pricing in the pain right now. We are looking at the toxic combination of high inflation driven by energy costs alongside stagnant economic growth as industrial production grinds to a halt.
Yes.
Both the IMF and the World Bank have already rushed out emergency warnings that this Hormuz oil shock could slice global GDP by 0.5 to 1.5% this year alone.
This dynamic creates what central bankers refer to as the impossible choice. Let's look at the setup coming into 2026.
Okay.
The U.S. Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank had successfully navigated a massive hiking cycle. Inflation finally seemed to be cooling toward their 2% targets, and the markets were eagerly gearing up for a series of rate cuts to stimulate growth.
We were almost there.
But now, with energy prices surging, real-time consumer price index, or CPI, data is jumping aggressively. We are seeing near-term projections leap from 2.4% up to 2.8% almost instantly, purely driven by the energy component.
And the bond market reaction has been brutal.
Absolutely brutal. Look at the 2-year Treasury yield, which is hypersensitive to Fed policy expectations. It has violently spiked from 3.37% to 3.64% in a matter of days.
That is a massive move in fixed income.
As a result, the futures traders have entirely repriced their expectations. The dream of a deeply accommodative Fed is dead. They now expect only one single solitary rate cut in all of 2026, down from the multiple cuts they confidently priced in just a month ago.
They're boxed in.
The central banks are boxed in. They cannot cut rates to support the slowing economy because they are absolutely terrified of letting this oil-driven inflation become unanchored and structural.
So let's connect this directly to you, the listener. What does a 3.64% 2-year yield and a paralyzed Federal Reserve actually mean for your wallet?
It's expensive.
It means if you were sitting on the sidelines, waiting for mortgage rates to drop significantly this summer to finally buy a house, you were likely out of luck. The cost of capital is staying high.
Right.
If you were hoping your credit card interest rates would finally cool off, or if you run a small business and need to roll over a commercial loan, the math just got significantly more expensive. The macroeconomic friction is bleeding directly into personal finance.
It touches everyone.
And while the bond market is repricing the cost of money, the equity markets have been an absolute bloodbath in specific energy-sensitive sectors. Let's look at the global stock market carnage. Who are the clear losers of Black March?
The unquestionable epicenter of the equity panic has been in Asia, specifically South Korea. The KSOPI index suffered a historic catastrophic crash, plunging 12.06% in a single trading session.
12%.
That incredibly violent move wiped out $500 billion in market value before the closing bell even rang.
A 12% drop for an entire developed national index in one day is staggering. That is systemic panic. Why was South Korea specifically hit so disproportionately hard compared to the rest of the world?
It comes down to their fundamental macroeconomic architecture. South Korea is a massive, highly advanced industrial powerhouse. They manufacture the high-end physical goods the world relies on,
But they don't have the energy.
but they possess virtually zero domestic energy resources. They import almost 100% of their energy needs, and a massive percentage of that critical energy flow comes directly from the Middle East, right through the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, wow.
When the strait closed, institutional traders instantly realized that South Korea's entire industrial base was facing an existential, margin-crushing cost crisis.
Right, because an advanced semiconductor fabrication plant uses a mind-boggling amount of continuous electricity.
Exactly. And when the power grid relies on imported LNG and oil had just doubled in price, the input costs for those tech giants explode. You saw their crown jewel tech companies drag down violently in the broader panic.
Samsung took a hit.
Samsung plummeted 11.7%, and SK Hynix fell 9.6%. Even though they make microscopic semiconductors, not gas-guzzling cars, the broader market sell-off and the realization of their energy vulnerability pulled everything down.
If a Samsung fab has to slow production because the national grid is stressed, global tech supply chains shatter.
That's the fear.
And the contagion wasn't isolated to Asia. Europe took a massive structural hit as well. The German DAX fell 6.9% in a week. Germany's entire post-war economic miracle was built on highly efficient, energy-intensive manufacturing, traditionally fueled by cheap Russian gas.
And now Middle Eastern oil is choked off.
Exactly. The industrial base is suffocating. We saw specialized chemical giants like Lanxess absolutely plummet, dropping 17.4%. Their entire business model is essentially alchemy, turning relatively cheap energy and feedstocks into high-value specialty chemicals.
When the input cost doubles overnight, the profit margins don't just compress, they instantly vanish into negative territory.
And, unsurprisingly, the global aviation sector was immediately crushed. Airlines operate on razor-thin margins and run almost entirely on highly refined jet fuel.
Korean Air dropped 8.9%, and Japan Airlines fell 5.2%.
The calculus for airline executives right now is a nightmare. They are facing a scenario where they either have to absorb these massive, unexpected fuel costs and post huge quarterly losses, destroying shareholder value, or they have to aggressively hike ticket prices to pass the cost to the consumer.
But in a stagflationary environment where consumer travel budgets are already tight, hiking prices too much means demand absolutely collapses.
However, in any macroeconomic dislocation of this magnitude, capital doesn't just evaporate into thin air, it rotates. It violently seeks out the sectors that benefit from the chaos. While the broader manufacturing and tech markets bled, there were distinct, incredibly profitable winners. Let's look at the profiteers of the crisis.
First and foremost, the defense sector. The moment a major geopolitical conflict breaks out involving key global powers in the Middle East, institutional capital floods into military contractors. It is the most predictable trade on Wall Street.
Lockheed Martin jumped 6%.
Northrop Grumman was up 5%, and over in Europe, anticipating a massive increase in sovereign defense spending, the German defense firm Rheinmetall gained 3%.
Then, obviously, for the energy sector itself, but specifically energy producers located securely outside of the conflict zone. If you are pumping oil from a politically stable jurisdiction right now, you just won the lottery. Norway's Equinor, which operates heavily in the North Sea, jumped 8%.
And we absolutely must highlight the U.S. shale producers here. This is a crucial dynamic for the American domestic economic picture. Over the last decade of technological innovation, U.S. shale operators in places like the Permian Basin have become incredibly efficient.
Their break fens are super low now.
Right. Their operational break-even, costs, the price of a barrel of oil they need to simply cover their drilling, pumping, and corporate expenses, are generally sitting between $40 and $60 a barrel.
Incredible.
So with global oil prices suddenly rocketing past $100 and touching 119, these domestic producers are practically printing cash. Their free cash flow and profit margins have exploded overnight. The constraint for them isn't price. It's how fast they can source steel pipe and drilling crews to punch new holes in the ground.
And finally, the ultimate historical safe haven gold. When the geopolitical world looks like it's catching fire, supply chains are fracturing, and energy-driven inflation expectations violently spike, investors run for the oldest, most reliable safety net in the financial playbook,
Gold surged 5.2% in a matter of days.
hitting an astonishing all-time record high of $5,400 an ounce. That wasn't a calculated bet on industrial use, that was sheer blind panic capital fleeing to safety.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what we are observing across these markets is the rapid, undeniable acceleration of what analysts are calling energy statism.
Energy statism.
For the last few decades, the global economy largely operated under the assumption of a mostly free market global energy trade. Oil flowed to where it was needed, priced by open markets. But this Hormuz crisis has cemented the harsh reality that energy policy is no longer just a subsector of macroeconomics.
It's a weapon.
It is the ultimate apex weapon of foreign policy, national survival, and monetary control. The ability to secure hydrocarbons is now equal in strategic importance to the stability of the financial system itself. We are seeing sovereign nations completely rip up the free market playbook and violently pivot to drastic state-level national survival strategies.
Absolutely. The mask of the free market is off. Look at how different countries are reacting purely on a sovereign level to protect their own populations and industrial bases. Japan, for example.
Japan is fascinating.
They are incredibly vulnerable as an island nation that imports almost every drop of fuel they consume. But they are aggressively managing the crisis by relying on massive, state-directed domestic stockpiles. Over the years, they have meticulously built up an astounding 254 days of emergency reserves.
That's massive preparation.
They aren't panicking. They are trying to methodically ride out the storm through pure state-mandated preparation.
Contrast that methodical approach with the panic in South Korea. As we discussed, their stock market was in free fall, and the threat to their industrial core was existential. So the government stepped in with a massive, unprecedented market intervention.
The price caps.
They instituted a strict, state-mandated domestic price cap on gasoline and diesel. They are artificially shielding their citizens and their vital businesses from the true cost of that $119 barrel of oil.
But the market still demands its pound of flesh.
Always. To maintain that artificial price cap, the South Korean government is directly taking the financial hit, absorbing huge amounts of fiscal debt to subsidize the true cost of energy. It is an act of fiscal dominance, a desperate measure to prevent a total domestic economic collapse, trading future sovereign debt for immediate social and industrial stability.
And then over in Europe, the political rhetoric has become incredibly stark and introspective. You have EU President Ursula von der Leyen publicly and very bluntly lamenting Europe's structural disadvantage. The reality is brutal. The EU imports roughly 90% of its oil and 80% of its gas.
They're trapped.
They are fundamentally structurally at the mercy of global maritime supply chains and Middle Eastern stability. She has even gone so far in recent addresses to call the previous multi-decade political movement to aggressively reduce and decommission nuclear energy across Europe a massive strategic mistake.
It left them exposed.
The green transition was the goal, but decommissioning the nuclear baseload before the renewables were ready left them entirely exposed to this exact kind of geopolitical blackmail and volatility.
Which brings us to the incredibly complex realpolitik of the United States in this crisis. The U.S. is in a uniquely bifurcated position. On one hand, high gas prices at the pump hurt American consumers deeply, fuel inflation, and create absolute political nightmares for any sitting administration.
But on the other hand,
The U.S. is also the world's largest oil producer. While the consumer suffers, the massive domestic energy sector reaps incredible windfalls, supporting corporate tax revenues and regional economies in states like Texas and North Dakota. But the political and diplomatic maneuvering to try and contain the global fallout has been extraordinary to watch in real time.
so what does this all mean when the rubber meets the road diplomatically and politically? We saw the immense, almost frightening power of presidential rhetoric in a hyper-financialized market.
That was wild.
President Trump literally just made an off-the-cuff statement suggesting that the geopolitical conflict could end very soon. That was it. Just 2 words of optimism. There were no signed treaties, no troop withdrawals, no physical barrels of oil changing hands.
And yet the algorithmic trading programs and the terrified, over-leveraged hedge funds reacted instantly.
That single, unverified statement triggered an immediate, violent 7% intraday plummet in global oil prices. It shows you how highly strung and purely reactive the market is right now. A mere hint, a whisper of diplomatic resolution causes massive, multi-billion-dollar price swings.
Furthermore, beyond the public rhetoric, we are seeing the raw, unvarnished mechanics of geopolitical leverage in action behind the scenes. There are widespread, credible reports leaking out regarding intense backdoor diplomacy.
Specifically, reports of a direct phone call between President Trump and Russian President Putin.
The reported substance of the call, according to the analysts following the situation, involved highly sensitive discussions about potentially waiving or easing certain international sanctions on Russian oil.
The strategic goal would be to allow Russian crude to flow more freely into the global market to fill the massive 8 million barrel gap left by the Middle East blockade.
And just to be absolutely clear with you, our listener, we are looking at this strictly and entirely through the lens of market mechanics, commodity flows, and real politics.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoint, evaluating the morality of sanctions, or judging the actions of any specific global leader. We are simply analyzing the raw facts of the situation.
The physical reality is that the global macroeconomy is starving, missing 8 million barrels of oil a day. The U.S. and Europe absolutely need that top-line price to come down rapidly to prevent a devastating deep recession.
Russia physically has the oil, but is heavily restricted by international sanctions. Meanwhile, massive consumers like India and other developing nations are already scrambling for alternatives to Middle Eastern crude. And Russia is seeing a massive financial windfall as those buyers prioritize immediate economic survival over previous geopolitical boundaries.
The diplomatic chess match being played right now involves the very real possibility of trading sanctions relief for physical supply, prioritizing immediate global economic and financial stability over established geopolitical fault lines.
It perfectly, ruthlessly encapsulates the era of energy statism. The established rules of international sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and free market trade are being rapidly rewritten in real time.
Why? Simply because the sheer, undeniable physical necessity of keeping the global economy fueled and preventing a cascade of sovereign defaults overrides almost all other ideological concerns. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, idealism takes a back seat to the desperate base need for hydrocarbons.
It's a sobering, cold reality, and it brings us fully back to why you, the listener, need to pay close attention to the mechanics of this, rather than just the headlines. It is so easy to look at a map, see a tiny 21-mile-wide strait on the other side of the planet, and mentally disconnect, thinking it doesn't really affect your daily life here.
But as we've unpacked today, the global economy is a single, tightly woven organism.
A physical blockade in the Persian Gulf translates directly and almost instantly to the price of the groceries you buy this weekend, because the diesel required to truck that produce from the farm to the store just doubled in cost.
It translates directly to the interest rate on your next mortgage or car loan, because the Federal Reserve is trapped into keeping rates high to fight the inflation caused by that exact oil shock.
And it translates directly to the wild, gut-wrenching volatility you are seeing if you check your 401k or retirement accounts, as capital violently rotates away from the tech stocks you own into the defense and energy sectors you might not. The macro is the micro.
This raises an important question, and perhaps a deeply provocative final thought for our listeners to mull over as they watch this crisis unfold. Let's assume the absolute best-case scenario for the G7 coalition. Let's assume they successfully coordinate and execute this massive 400 million barrel SPR release.
Okay, best case.
The announcement effect works perfectly. They physically flood the market, break the speculative fever, and stabilize prices today to save the 2026 economic data. Even in that victory scenario, they have essentially executed the largest naked short trade in the history of the financial markets against the physical commodity of oil.
I know exactly where you're going with this. The analysts are whispering about the replenishment problem.
Exactly, the replenishment problem. The oil in those strategic reserves, those salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana, the tanks in Japan isn't magic. It is a physical asset that absolutely has to be replaced for national security purposes.
Right, they can't just leave it empty.
By aggressively draining their safety nets to historic, dangerous lows today to manipulate the current price, the U.S., Europe, and Japan are virtually guaranteeing that they will have to enter the open market as massive, desperate, price-insensitive buyers in the very near future.
Wow.
By 2027, as the immediate crisis hopefully fades, sovereign governments will be legally and strategically forced to buy back hundreds of millions of barrels of oil to refill those empty salt caverns and tanks. This future, unavoidable obligation creates a massive, guaranteed, multi-year wave of sovereign demand.
And that locked-in future demand could put a permanent, unbreakable floor under global gas prices for years to come. What it essentially means, mathematically, is that the era of truly cheap, abundant energy might not just be temporarily suspended for Black March. It might be over for good. A heavy, complex thought to leave you with, but an absolutely essential one to understand where the global economy is heading next. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Leave you with this thought in volatile times like these, when the foundations of the global economy are shifting. Make sure you are watching the physical shipping lanes and the infrastructure bottlenecks just as closely as you watch the flashing stock tickers. Until next time.